be it sounds. It can be observed at any level of linguistic organization, be it sounds, phonological arrangements, lexicon, morphology, syntax, discourse, pragmatics, and so on. No phonological process, for instance, operates uniformly across languages, whether it is as simple as a phenomena such as voicing, sparentization, palatalization, or something else. This is because these are not built to a common pattern. New structures, new languages arising out of contact keep reshaping the human linguistic diversity. In fact, I would say one of the most remarkable and challenging aspects of human language has been its linguistic and cultural diversity more than anything else, and that is despite its biological uniformity of the speakers. Contrary to the expectations of progressive decrease in linguistic diversity due to increased exposure to national media, education, increased mobility, and globalization, we find proliferation of dialectal diversity everywhere. In North America, the vernaculars have got stronger over time than disappear under the influence of standard American English. In Northern Australia, despite adverse conditions, the existing Aboriginal linguistic communities, however small, have realigned themselves, giving rise to stable non-polyglossic, that means egalitarian, small-scale multilingual communities. World Englishes have multiplied manifold over the past few hundred years. Acts of mobility have made languages even more pluricentric and pluriverse. Mandarin has become, sorry, just a minute. Yeah. Mandarin has become the second most spoken language in the world, followed by Hindi. In India, the expanding footprints of Hindi nationwide have been essentially driven by external factors such as the film industry, which immortalized Hindi songs, and later by increased mobility, hugely contributed by IT revolution in the country starting in the 90s, and other economic factors. The Linguistic Diversity Index of Asia and Pacific, and India included, at large has not shown a downward trend either. Globally, urban centers are increasingly becoming multicultural and multilingual. If we do not entangle ourselves into the puzzle of what to count as a language, the world is much more diverse than what we think it is. It is difficult to have an exact estimate of diversity. In India, languages have diffused across state boundaries, rendering the very idea of linguistic reorganization futile. Unlike the act of partition of India, which sought to redistribute populations along religious lines, linguistic reorganization of India moved or redrew the boundaries without moving people. Thus, the constituent states of multilingual Federation of India, though conceptualized along sameness of language and culture, were heterogeneous from the beginning and became increasingly more so with time. Social proliferation of linguistic diversity over time is suggestive of the social and historical origins of language and the role of human agency. Moreover, a language has no existence without a sense of space, time, and its speakers. Languages are not singular monolithic entities as the language labels seem to suggest. On the contrary, language is pluralistic by nature. Hence, there are multiple Englishes, Hindis, Punjabis, Assamias, Banglas, Tamils, Malayalams, and so on, and yet known by the same label. What about the labels such as English grammar, relative clauses in Hindi, or ergativity in Punjabi, or S voicing in English? These are at best misleading, often resulting in disagreements among speakers. For instance, ergativity is not uniform across Punjabi speech varieties. Some, in fact, may not even have it. So language can be analyzed only with reference to some notion of space, and time. Language varies in space. By listening to one speech, people can tell where are you from, or at least whether you are a local or an outsider. Smaller languages and smaller regions are also equally diverse. A language manifests itself through its numerous speech varieties, newer of which keep emerging through acts of mobility and change. So Delhi is a good example, for example, which has produced newer versions of almost every language over time that is spoken here. If you go to Calcutta or Chandigarh and happen to speak Bangla or Punjabi, people would tell you that you are not local. Next, are languages merely the instruments of communication, or there is more to it? If languages were to be merely the instruments of communication, as modern linguistics made it out to be, then languages would be simpler, fewer in number, and specialized to serve that function. They would also be stable and not change, as every act of change makes communication that much more challenging. Instead, the primary purpose of language seems to be interaction, socialization, and grooming, which makes the formal act of classroom learning and teaching so much more challenging. Decline in language socialization as we age is hugely responsible for cognitive decline that sets in. There's a growing acceptance of the social origins of human language across disciplines, especially among those with an interest in language evolution. Far from assuming animal communication systems, far from assuming animal communication systems as totally different from that of humans, human language has important parallels in non-human species. For instance, research suggests that non-human primates, also dogs and birds, make use of vocalizations to modulate social dynamics. Seyfarth and Cheney postulates that key elements of human language must have emerged from the need to decipher and encode complex social interactions in large multi-layered communities. Some people also trace the origin of language in gossip and social bonding among large groups. Social communication, therefore, seems to be the biological foundation upon which evolution must have built complex aspects of human language through change. For our purposes, the social nature of language highlights that language is a collective endeavor. Therefore, existence of human languages cannot be imagined without speakers, communities, and cultures, which got increasingly more complex over time. This is further evident in the fact that individuals are not just speakers engaged in self-monologues, but speakers with multiple memberships in simultaneously in various groups, generations, and various social cultural groups in a speech community. Can languages be learned, conceptualized, studied, or even imagined by removing them from their speakers and their communities and their interactive practices? The answer is no. Considering languages as biological endowment does not negate the fact that they have no existence independent of their speakers and communities. Therefore, viewing them without locating them in time and space makes no sense. If language is social in origin and purpose, or even if a bioculture hybrid, then there cannot be an adequate theory of language that is essentially asocial. The idea of social nature of language is compatible with variation within and across individuals in terms of linguistic outputs and fluctuation in judgments on various tasks. Like any other species, we are designed to learn songs of our own species. We are designed to learn as many songs or languages as we are exposed to. We are also lifelong learners. Never mind the undue emphasis on creative abilities of children and critical age hypothesis, which many still believe in, but some don't. And I also happen to not believe in that. There are also gaps between what we are exposed to and what we learn. This happens because we are imperfect learners. You can find an example. If 15 people watch the same incident, there would be 15 different ways of reporting it. Language learning is outwardly oriented, which means that children break away from parental speech patterns early on to align with the patterns of their age cohorts and a broader pattern of the speech community, if that is not in conformity with the speech of their parents. Language is a constantly evolving entity through change. Languages have evolved, they have histories, they are designed to change. No language has remained unchanged. These facts tell us something about the nature of learning. Children, in the process of acquiring language of their communities, favorably respond to the innovations that are set in motion by the older members of their own generation, thereby propelling changes forward. In the case of children of immigrant communities, very often they may not have access to an optimal set of age cohorts. Therefore, far from being static or given, language forms what Christiansen calls a moving target. This is contrary to the unusual emphasis laid on children and their creative abilities in generative theories of grammar, assuming that children receive impoverished inputs in the form of baby talk from adults, which is not very helpful to them in instructing children in their pursuit of language acquisition. Poverty of stimulus would then ensure only a break between children and their parents and lack of transmission across generation, thus failing to account for the unbroken chain of continuities across generation, which is also an important hallmark of human language. The everyday terms, such as language dialect, that we use without thinking are not scientific or objective terms. You can hear something and decide whether it's a language or a dialect. You can't do that. There are also terms like slangs, pidgins, and creoles used and promoted as well-defined terms. The idea of language is linked with modern nation states and their national standard languages. The new nations were based on sameness of language and ethnicity, that is race, whereas no nation was homogeneous at any point in time. Once the national language became established, it became the unmarked norm, and the remaining diversity was reduced to non-standard. Education played a key role in dissemination of the national standard language ideologies. There are common stereotypes which try to draw a contrast between language and dialect as high and low, one having literature, having grammar, and the other lacking it, or mutual intelligibility arguments, etc. It is such folk beliefs that further dismissed the study of diversity. The terms native speaker, foreign language, or second language, or kinship metaphors such as mother tongue are definable only with reference to a nation, and nation refers to the motherland. Mother tongue doesn't refer to our biological mothers. The impact can be seen widely across linguistics, where the new written standards, as the citation forms, became the new unmarked norms against which diversity was evaluated. These also became the authentic sources of data for linguistic inquiry, no wonder. Though this visibly had maximum impact on world Englishes because they have been studied so much, the influence went far beyond, affecting modes and models of linguistic inquiry. And in that process, complicating the ways in which languages and language structures were analyzed, and the way linguistic knowledge came to be understood. Some of the binaries, such as native, non-native, mother tongue, other tongue, first language, second language, monolingualism, bilingualism, standard, non-standard, synchrony, diachrony, language, dialect, etc., gave rise to competence-based essentialist models. These continue to serve as models for evaluating success schools in second language classrooms and outside, affecting particularly the children of migrant or the so-called other communities, as well as speakers of non-standard dialects, generally non-white and those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, if we talk about the Western context. This is amply evident in research on education in the 60s and early 70s by sociologists, educationists, psychologists who believed in deficit model of learner and learning outcomes in the context of, for instance, Afro-American population, and questioned the logic of non-standard English and their speakers. There's a very famous study by Leboeuf, 1982, and also others on logic of non-standard English that I recommend. If you have a chance, please read it. The binaries and the typologies, backed by a priori assumptions, had the unwanted effect of naturalizing the marked as the new unmarked. While the 19th century discourses affected a whole range of social sciences and humanities, as well as natural sciences, it had the most detrimental effect on the study of language and allied disciplines. This contributed to the rise of the dominant and hegemonic theories without interrogating them. Various subfields of linguistics built themselves, at least initially, drawing heavily upon such theories, ignoring local social practices and lived experiences. As a result, study of language and linguistics increasingly became disengaged with speakers and communities which sustain them. The Western influences also globalized hegemonic models of linguistics. It was the efforts of William Leboeuf which brought the Black scholarship and activists together, which made it possible for the mothers of Black children in Michigan, Ann Arbor to win the court case against the school authorities. It also demonstrated that Black English is not devoid of logic, nor do Black children suffer from verbal deficit. It demonstrated how the tools of testing academic achievements are heavily biased in favor of the whites, and the native attitudes of the school authorities place children of color at a disadvantage. These are some of the binary views on dialect and language you could see here. Okay, so how standard are standards? Smartman 2012 carried out a survey of 7 nations to find out people's conception of standard language in their own country. The aim of the survey was to find out lay perceptions on the intrinsic qualities of standard language and characteristics of speakers of standard language. The survey results suggest the absence of agreement on any single characteristics of either standard language or its speakers, etc. And yet we tend to take standardness for granted. Some people even tend to view it as earlier and historically unmarked. In reality, this naming depends on several external factors. If you like, you can Google and see the definitions of standard language across dictionaries. Your meeting will end in 10 minutes. Is it going to end in 10 minutes?
Yeah.
Yes.
Then are we going to reconnect it?
Yeah, then we will reconnect it.
Okay. So you could see here, this table shows the characteristics of standard language, and one can see that there is no consensus among speakers within or across different countries. The countries that they investigated includes England, Flanders, Japan, Netherlands, New Zealand, Poland, United States. The ones in circle are the highest scoring characteristics. And you can see the same results on this table also, which talks about the what kind of people speak standard language in particular. And again, we find no consensus across speakers. Likewise, the concept of native speaker is also problematic. It is grounded more in the idea of an assumed monocultural nation. It might be tenable if there is no mobility or language contact. It need not even be the same across a family. We acquire the languages of the surroundings, what we are exposed to. These are some of the binaries, various binaries that I have put on the screen: uniformity, diversity, individual society, language, dialect, native speaker, non-native, multilingualism, monolingualism, static view of language or dynamic view of language, and various other points here. So against this background, we can move closer to understanding what sociolinguistics is all about. Unlike generative grammar tradition, where an individual is the perfect representative of linguistic knowledge of a language that he or she speaks, sociolinguistics considers it as a collective property of a speech community. It places the community as conceptually and analytically prior to the individual. Why? Because linguistic knowledge is not uniformly distributed across individuals. Therefore, no individual knows the language of its community in entirety. This asymmetry can be seen in differences that exist between individuals and across groups, however those are defined. Only through the collective, an individual can be properly understood. The very nature of language is inherently variable at every level of conceivable structural organization. The presence of change through innovation and contact, their diffusion across the speech community, and various other factors give rise to such asymmetry. Even family, the smallest unit, may be highly variable. It is possible to detect systematic differences across generations. If you try to draw your own family tree, you might find diverse places of origin for your parents and their parents and so on. And if you go on expanding the tree vertically and horizontally, you'll be surprised how diverse a family could be. In fact, village exogamy, which was widely practiced in marriages in India and probably still continues to be practiced in villages, ensured that brides generally came from outside the village. In some cases, it has been reported that brides are brought, you have to travel as many as 5 kilometers or 15 kilometers to bring your brides. So speech community is not really homogeneous, but it's highly heterogeneous. It also implies that linguistic variation exists within and across individuals, as well as within and across groups. Individuals have membership in multiple groups, however they are defined, such as family, age, gender, neighborhood, profession, background, generation, etc., etc. And also that primary purpose of language is socialization. So these factors link language with society. I'm just worried that this might just end abruptly, but anyway. So now we move on to the concept of grammar and talk about internal variation. So as I said earlier, language is inherently variable at every level of structure. What it means is that any language or speech variety presents linguistic choices in the form of more than one way of saying the same thing at various levels. For example, a variable n may be realized as n1, n2, n3, nn, that means any number of variants, in a series of overlapping environments. So unlike allophones or categorical view of grammar, such choices are not distributed only categorically, occurring in mutually exclusive environments, but overlapping context. A number of multifactorial linguistic constraints contribute to this selection of choices with different degrees of probabilities. These constraints are overlapping. Some may even be categorical to an extent. You could see this here. where you have the variable multiple realizations, and they are placed in angular brackets, not optional brackets, and constraints are also placed under angular brackets. We take an example of S voicing in English. Most books on introduction to linguistics contain the following example to explain allomorphy of plural marking in English. So if we add plural S to the following words, such as they would be realized as dogs, cats, benches, suggesting that voicing is the function of the preceding segment. This is a classic example of categorical grammar. But what if I tell you that this analysis does not reflect necessarily how real speakers actually speak? In other words, it could remain benches, pearls, gems, etc. In that case, what would be our options? You can use non-linguistic excuses such as optionality due to being lazy or errors, etc. But if it turns out that most speakers do this and do so repeatedly, then it is our responsibility to explore patterns in it and account for the same. There is no walking away from this. So how did we come up with these two different sets of observations that I just mentioned? One which talks about a nicely formulated or well-formulated rules based on features, voicing features of the preceding segments, and the other one says, well, they don't really work. The answer lies in our approach to data collection. One possibility is to ask explicitly a speaker, how would he or she say a particular set of words, or ask for their judgments on acceptability and correctness. Alternatively, observe people, how they speak when interacting with other speakers in everyday situations. Because there is no other way to discover variation. This is the first step to the discovery of variation. The reason that we fail to see variation is because of the methods that we use. Sociolinguistics draws its data from performance, and by sampling the speech community, by balancing factors relating to the composition of the speech community. Recall what I just said a few minutes ago, that linguistic knowledge is the collective property of a speech community and not of an individual. Okay. The first method, ask the informant, is actually a 19th century method that was designed to study the language of the other, in which the investigator often had no fluency or even any knowledge of. Such data is often conditioned, or maybe conditioned by standard language ideology, or by the expectation of the investigator. This is very well documented across Western Englishes in various classic studies, such as Crock and Small, Bell, Leboff, and so on. As a matter of fact, the variable S voicing has been reported and studied in a handful of studies on American English. In the English spoken in India, in Delhi, Bhattacharya 2017, who is present here, found very little S voicing, both morpheme. Okay, welcome back to the session. I hope you can see my screen. Yeah. Okay, so shall we begin? All right. So we were talking about, where is it? Yeah. We were talking about S voicing as an example, right? Right. So as a matter of fact, the variable S voicing has been reported and studied in a handful of research on American English. And in English spoken in India, Delhi specifically, Bhattacharya found very little S voicing, both morpheme internally and at the boundaries, most of which was not conditioned by the preceding segments. So a grammar is an estimate of the effects of various constraints on the selection. This requires an algorithm that would not only account for the observed variation in the given data, but is also testable and verifiable. So it's like a fuzzy logic. So the view of grammar that emerges from this is that even if it is based only on structural factors, gives you a reflection of the complexity of human language. This is one example of modeling variation and diversity. So what external factors? So while external factors do not directly influence the grammar, they open up a next question. How is the use of S-voicing, for instance, distributed across speakers in a speech community? Does everyone do it? Or do it to the same extent? Or are there differences across individuals? Are there speakers who never do this, or always do this, or do more or less? If that is the case, what kind of individuals show what kind of behavior? And what common factors bind them into a group with shared social properties? Language use of a variable, linguistic choices may not be uniformly distributed across a speech community. You can always analyze by excluding social factors, but it can sometimes also be unnecessarily misleading. So what sociolinguistics does is that it expands the notion of grammar from being simply categorical to include both categoricity and variability. The grammar is variable, and the constraints that produce such a grammar are multifactorial, based on conditioned probabilities. The various levels of grammar and social traits of speakers and other factors interact to produce the outputs. A grammar should be testable, verifiable, and should neither overgenerate nor undergenerate. The so-called abstract patterns, or how language works, can be accounted for by using a probabilistic method. Corpus-based, both written and oral data can be used to model grammar. Data and methods are always triangulated in sociolinguistics for better accountability, and experimental methods further add to the accountability. So why speech community-based approaches? I think you are getting the answer now. While you may very well study just a single individual and be able to discover properties of a particular structure, and you may also ignore external factors. However, it's only through a speech community-based approach that you can detect and observe ongoing changes or stability of variation, which together provide you a holistic description of the structural problem. An individual speech would therefore present partial picture, and patterns many a times will make sense only with respect to the larger speech community. Now I move on to the question of language change. Can linguistic changes be observed? Our predecessors, both structuralists and neo-grammarians, overestimated the difficulties in observing sound changes. It was believed that sound changes cannot be observed because either they are too gradual or too abrupt. Saussure also postulated a strict antinomy between synchrony and diachrony. According to Saussure, diachrony is psychologically unreal and doesn't form part of anyone's memory. Therefore, only those facts that are simultaneous and synchronic should be studied. Hence, modern linguistics increasingly became removed from the study of diachrony. Sociolinguistics, however, disagrees with both. Saussure overestimated the psychological unreality of the past. When a new form appears, the older form continues to coexist alongside the new form and is part of the psychological reality and active memory of the speakers. No new form or innovation instantly replaces all older forms in one stroke. Innovations have to travel through the space, both social and geographic, and take time to diffuse, affecting certain age groups more than the others, producing leaders and laggers with respect to the new form. So diachrony is always embedded in synchrony, and the two coexist with each other. What I have shown you here is actually two notions of time. One is the vertical time, which is the historical time or the real time as we travel from 1900, let's say, to 2000. And the other one is the horizontal time or apparent time or synchronic time. So multiple age groups coexist at any given point in the speech community, carrying with them varying depths of history. This is what gives us the synchronic time. So you may have a 91 years old and 4-year-olds. A 91-year-old speech will reflect more than 91 years of history. And we also inherit the history of a language as we learn it. So historical linguistics, while it had only temporal dimension, and that too only historical time was accessible to them. Sociolinguistics is in a position to go a step further and model language change by considering additional dimensions of space as well as synchronic time. This allows sociolinguistics to map changes in progress, even in the absence of diachrony. Not every language has been written down or studied, so we may not even have access to linguistic past in those languages. Does it mean we can't study change in those languages? No, we can. This is where apparent time comes handy. So this allows us to map changes in progress, even in the absence of diachrony. It has made phenomenal progress in the study of language change, what happens to grammar during change, and map various stages right from the inception of a change to reaching completion. If your sample spans from 4-year-olds to 100 years, you can work out 100 years of history of language. Another advantage, unlike historical linguistics, which is based on small data, whatever survived accidentally, social linguistics does not have this problem. So it's a study of language variation and change. Some people like to use a prefix variationist to social linguistics to distance it from sociology of language and anthropological linguistics. The term variation has been used in generative grammar too, but in a different sense. It studies variation across languages. That's a cross-linguistic variation, which is typological. Even study of variation across dialects, microparametric variation, is typological, and its approach has a different philosophy, which is parametric. There is nevertheless growing realization and acceptance of the importance of social linguistics approaches to linguistic variation across linguistics. So here are some established specialized journals and conferences of the field called variationist social linguistics. Some of these specialized conferences are New Ways of Analyzing Language Variation, one of the earliest ones, which is based in North America. Then you also have New Ways of Analyzing Language Variation in Asia Pacific and multiple versions of N-Wave conference. N-Wave, so Asia Pacific was started in 2010, the inaugural conference of which was held in Delhi. Then there is a UK Language Variation and Change Conference. There's a Language Variation in Europe. And there is also a new conference called SocioLinguistics, which is a broad umbrella conference centered on anthropology, but variation is increasingly becoming an important part of it. Then there is another important conference called Methods in Dialectology. And here are some journals. The two older journals that many of you are familiar are the Language in Society, International Journal of Sociology of Language. So they remind us of the social linguistics of the 60s. And since then, it has moved away in different directions, but mainly catering to the needs of sociology of language. It's not that they don't publish or accept variations. They actually do, but these are not specialized journals. The real specialized journals are Language Variation and Change, starting in 1989. Just a minute. Yeah. And Asia Pacific Language Variation, which starting in 2015. And there is another influential journal called Journal of Social Linguistics that is a very broadly focused, but also publishes very frequently on language variation and change. Then there is linguistic geography, and there is a proliferation of journals, right? And of these, The journal of, that means journal of LVC, Sociolinguistics. APLV is an exception because it is the only journal which is focused not on the West, but on Asia Pacific. Okay, so before I close, I want to bring one final example to you. This is an example of variation from Kohima village, Nagaland. And I bring you this example because Kohima village is a very small census statutory town with just 15,000 population and very small area which you can map on foot. As you can see, it has interesting variation in affricates and fricatives, which show alternations between alveolars and palatals. Okay, the first one is alveolar and the second one is palatal if you look across columns, right? Okay. Another interesting variation is the distribution of the various forms. These allophonic high and non-high onsets, phonemic before high vowels, and variable before two specific non-high vowels. The puzzle of palatalization in Tibeto-Burman is an old one and remains unresolved. It is, however, conditioned by tonal phonology and vowels, but there is more to it. It is the clan genealogy of a family, which is one of the most powerful explanatory factor, stronger than tonal phonology. As you could see on this slide, so unless we take clan structure of Kohima village, we cannot really account for the patterns observed here. There are 4 clans present in Kohima village. It's a small place in terms of area and population. And yet we find differences across the 4 clans, L, T, D, and P, with respect to palatalization. So while 2 of the clans use more palatals, I have labeled them as palatals, right? The other 2 use more alveolars. Any approach which ignores this social organization cannot produce a satisfactory account of the observed process. Kohima village practices clan exogamy, whereby women marry outside their clan and settle down in their husband's clan. So a sample has to be drawn in such a way that it represents various marital combinations. This is what Kelovino Suokri, from whose work I've taken this, did and produced an excellent account. So at the end, even if your goal is to produce analysis of a particular structure or write a grammar or documentation, sociolinguistics prepares you better for that. With these words, I thank you all and hope to see you next week. If there are any questions and comments, please feel free to say so.
Excuse me, ma'am. Can I ask something?
Sure, please do.
Though it may sound silly, but I was a little, first of all, thank you for your enlightened lecture. And your lecture has opened a point, idiolect as a point of departure for the social studies or sociolinguistic studies. So that is a great. The one thing I wanted to ask that in one slide, you told that we are imperfect learners. And if we take it in other way, can we say that we are imperfect imitators? If it is true, the creativity starts here. If it is not true, can we say that language learning has social constraint or it has some cognitive capping, something like that? So that is my point, ma'am.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Contrary to see what has happened over the past 100 years of the existence of this field is that the modernism which promoted the understanding of the universe as something similar and as a whole also influenced the social sciences and humanities. Hence, emerged the very universal paradigm, universal ways of understanding knowledge everywhere. But that's precisely that needs to be interrogated, and that has been interrogated, right? So what we are trying to say here is, so going by those theories where a lot of emphasis was placed on innate abilities to learn language. We are born with a language, or we are designed to learn in a particular language, no matter what happens. But we know that most deaf children are born to hearing parents, and they are exposed to sign language at various points in their lives, and that presents no difficulty to them, right? So, and since language language can only be learned by listening to it through exposure. If you are deprived, we won't learn it. And it doesn't matter what language our parents speak, no matter how much we tell our children, you have to speak in this language, we really can't control them, because they are going to end up learning languages that they hear from their classmates, from their friends, and the people around. So it doesn't matter if I'm a Gujarati. I may say I'm a Gujarati, but I don't know Gujarati, or I don't, which is perfectly legitimate. It's possible that my first child, if I move to Delhi, would know Gujarati, second one would know little less, and third one probably would refuse to speak Gujarati, right? Okay. And if languages did not change, languages would die by this time, right? So how do we, so when we move, okay, language doesn't really present barriers as far as India is concerned, because we are used to living in a multilingual environment. But the moment you move from in the same language region from one place to the other, you find people speak differently, and you stand out. When somebody comes to your town, you can say, well, this person seems to be an outsider. Some people in Delhi can say, oh, who is from Old Delhi and who is not from Old Delhi, right? So if we were not imperfect learners, then changes wouldn't happen. This is the scope. We don't learn it from our parents. We are exposed to language at home first from the family, but very early on we move away by paying attention to the others. We are imitators. If we were perfect replicators, then language would remain the same for millenniums to come, right? But that hasn't happened. There is no language which has remained unchanged. This is what I said. Please identify yourself.
My name is Dr. Parman Singh. Earlier, I have worked in Central Institute of Indian Languages, Mysore. Right now, I'm a regional director in Central Institute of Hindi at Mysore Center.
I see. Thank you for your question. Anyone else?
Can I ask one question?
Please do, Niranjan.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the lecture, madam. It was very informative, and I felt that it was also very updated. I was just wondering, in the coming classes, if possible, I think you may also tell us about the textbooks that we can use to teach social linguistics in our classes, because that is a fundamental problem that we always face. What textbooks to use, because it's a matter of one semester, and we have to teach so many things. So I was just wondering if this is possible. I think it will be very nice. I think I have a lot of questions, but I will not ask. I will wait for others. Yeah, thank you.
Sure, I'll be happy to share references and textbooks, but a textbook is not the best way to teach social linguistics. Yet there are 2 or 3 books which I think everyone must read, which I'll share with you. Anyone else?
Thank you.
You may ask your question, Niranjan.
Yeah. So in one of the slides, you said that a language can't be removed from its speech community and studied. I think the comment was something in that lines, if I remember correctly. And I was just wondering that I understand the position. I understand, and that is a routine position that social linguists take. But then, how do we relate ourselves with the traditional grammars and so many grammars that have come, before the rise of social linguistics? Because for example, the Indian classical tradition, grammatical tradition, when they talk about language structures, they don't directly comment on the speech communities. In fact, we don't know what they are referring to when they say that speech communities. So, how do we relate? This is one question. Yeah.
Okay. See, you have to actually see what that grammar writing activity was meant for. Who was writing it and who were the consumers of it. I think they were more, as far as I understand, the existing grammatical traditions are more in dialogue with the literary writers. So these are aids for those who were writing at that time more than anything else. And if you further move on in time, we are surprised to find a huge gap in the grammar writing traditions, right? So after Sanskrit, for example, within the Indo-Aryan belt, then you hardly have Prakrit grammars, and there is a gap for, say, a very long gap. And those who do produce Prakrit grammars, they would refer to Sanskrit. And even those who wrote Sanskrit grammar, there are always references to others. The problem is that we have not been exposed to many other grammarians like Matilal, for example, who would tell you about the variation in Sanskrit that existed. So there are, and also they were not penned down in the first go. They were penned down probably, I don't know, maybe a few hundred years later, after this huge valuable treaties were designed, right? So a lot of things, that's how the commentaries came and so on and so forth. So yes, I'm not saying that you cannot write, but that's precisely where you find the problem of understanding those grammars, because whole lot of variation has crept into those grammars, into the early Ashokan inscriptions that you find, any inscriptional materials that you actually come across, you find a great deal of variability that you find depending upon which region a particular script or a manuscript or specimen has actually come up with. So within the Paninian grammar also, we don't know who to blame. The way it has been, penned down, you do find scope for a whole lot of variation. So the idea is not that you cannot analyze a structure or you cannot do anything, but you cannot really do justice necessarily. As we know, the study of existing grammar, the more you actually study, you find that our understanding remains complicated. So for example, retroflexion remains an unresolved problem. Now, if we treat retroflexion in Sanskrit as a single phenomenon, which operates uniformly, as a single phonological process that operates uniformly on all consonants, that's where our troubles begin. It doesn't. And it is also not meant to be applied categorically, regardless of the region where it is coming from, right? So I think it's a pretty good source where you see evidence for going beyond and including space and a speech community in your models. Does that satisfy you?
Yeah, that is fine. Yeah, thank you.
Anyone else?
I think
Any
there is
observation?
no. Yeah, I think I will add one more if that's not.
Sure, please do.
If you talked about critical period hypothesis, critical period hypothesis, if I remember correctly, it is applicable to first language acquisition. When we talk about second language acquisition, the critical period is debatable. But I think when we talk about first language acquisition, critical period hypothesis still holds. Am I correct?
In that case, see, certain beliefs are so well ingrained that it's hard to break from them, right? But there is enough evidence available. The reason I'm arguing against that is that if children have such creative abilities, if children are so plastic and so well designed to learn, well, we are all designed, then the acquisition should be over within the first 6-7 years, but it's not. Language acquisition continues at least for 13 to 14 years. And we are lifelong learners. And adults also have no problem. There have been many, many successful adult speakers. And the fact that language changes is a moving target. We have to be constant learners. First language or second language, how do you decide? if you live in a multilingual environment and you are simultaneously exposed to more than one language, and if it so happens that one of those languages become a more primary language and later in life, how do you really talk about first and second language? We think very naively when we talk about these terms, but these terms are actually problematic. If you are sequentially exposed to the second only, and first you were exposed only to one, maybe we can talk about it, but I don't think we learn languages like in the order, first one, second. It looks like, but that's not how we do it. Comprehension, we are exposed to multiple languages. They are part of our exposure, our learning, our competence. Children are they are not innovators. None of the existing, if we scan the available literature on language change, we do not find any evidence of children being the innovators. Innovations begin with young adults, 16, 18 years, or a little older. 7-year-olds are not innovators. We would have expected them to be if this statement was to be correct, but it's not. Would you buy this?
Yeah, that is fine. When we talk about simultaneous acquisition, of course, we will run into the problem of identifying first language and second language. I think in such cases, we don't have to bring in the discussion of first language, second language at all. But when we talk about sequential acquisition cases, cases of learning foreign languages, I think, I think studies suggest that if those things happen early in the life, the learners are more successful than the late learners. Am I correct?
I don't know about late learners or the early learners, but I think this whole idea of that we learn one language or it is possible to be exposed to only one language. I think you need to look into your family tree, whether your parents speak the same variety. You find so many cases, right? People having one parent from East Bengal, another one having from West Bengal, and they are simultaneously exposed to more than one variety. And in Nagaland, the example I cited, 2 parents come from 2 different clan backgrounds, so they speak differently. So in every case, we don't necessarily mandate children to pick one or the other, but what comes out of it is actually it's a mixed language. It's a combination of both. They decide how to choose. So, this whole idea of language as something that we understand what it is, and it is complete in itself, and it is monolithic, that is problematic. What I'm trying to say is the language as an entity itself is pluralistic. It's not singular and monolithic as we have been made to believe. That is what I meant.
Thank you very much. I think only 5 minutes left, so I think other people, if they want to ask, please ask later.
If we suddenly are blocked out, please accept my thanks, and we'll meet next time. But I'm waiting until it is still on. If there are any comments or observations, feel free to ask.
Ma'am, may I ask a question?
Please do.
I'm Shweta. I work at the Department of English in University of Delhi. And this time we have an elective for our students, which is called the study of language, in which one unit deals with language, ideology, and policy, which is the unit that I'm teaching. So will you be able to shed some light on how I should approach it? Because you just talked about standardization. And language policy and planning also in a way comes into play when you're looking at standard and non-standard variety. As I'm not someone who has done the masters in linguistics, your thoughts would be quite helpful. And this lecture was quite enlightening for me as well. Thank you so much.
I would only say send me an email so that I can guide you towards some materials, right? Yeah.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you so much.
So, only re-enter. If any question we can ask, we can have. Actually, the speech was very enlightening and very helpful. And so, only it is due to these interruptions, due to time limits, as you already said. Anyway, I invite Dr. Anju to propose what the parents. My congratulations to Professor Shobha Satyanath for having this enlightening lecture.
So for the interruption in the convenience because of the platform is like this. Once again, sorry for good afternoon, distinguished guest Professor Shobha Satyanath, our director, Professor G.K. Panikkar, and the participants online and offline mode on the behalf of ISTL to propose vote of thanks. I thank on the occasion. First and foremost, I thank our special guest, Professor Shobha Satyanath, former Professor, Department of Linguistics, University of Delhi, for a very informative lecture. Thank you, ma'am. In this lecture, she delivered lecture based on philosophy-based sociolinguistics. Sociolinguistics is interested in understanding diversity, language in pluralistic, the concept of grammar. Thank you, ma'am. Very informative lecture. I would like to thank our director, Professor G.K. Panikkar, for arranging this lecture series. Thank you, sir. I also thank all the participants in both online and offline mode for making first day of lecture series a grand success. Once again, I thank one and all. Thank you.